Hey everyone. So today we are going to be discussing the aims of community research. So we'll be talking about values in community research and various philosophies of science, or as we call them, epistemology. And that has to do with the way in which we think we understand truth and where truth comes from. Then we'll be talking about community collaborations and understanding at what ecological level we are conducting our research, and at what ecological level we are influencing. So first, there are three general, well, your book will show you four, but for this talk we'll be going over three general questions for conducting community research, and one overarching question that we really need to think about when we're conducting community research is who will generate what knowledge, for whom, and for what purposes. So when you think about that question, it really boils down to who's doing the research, right? On what population, so for whom are you doing the research, and why is the research being conducted? And so when you think about that question, there are various additional questions that we need to address when we're conducting community research. And one of the first major questions is, what values and assumptions do we bring to our work? Now, community research is quite different than sort of your standard social science, standard psychological science perspective of research. And we'll get into that in a second, and that has to do with epistemology, or philosophy of science, and which philosophy of science you adopt as a researcher. And so a question is, for us as community researchers, is research value neutral? Now, there's one philosophy of science that says yes, that research is value neutral, that it's objective. However, the philosophies of science that community psychologists adopt would argue no, that research is not value neutral, and I'll show you why. So now let's dig into philosophies of science, and this is where we get into the values aspect and the value of your science, and where you feel your science sits in terms of your value system. Now, positivism is interesting, and it's sort of the oldest philosophy of science, right? It's the science that was created to really understand a basic knowledge, right? It was created under the assumption that knowledge is value-free, and that, or some semblance of knowledge that is generalizable across all populations. So if we can get to that underlying knowledge, then we're closer to understanding the reality of truth, or what truth actually is in that particular arena, or around that particular idea. So the way we do this is we identify cause and effect, we use quantitative measurement, and we identify cause and effect through manipulating variables and controlling variables, and really isolating variables to see which variable causes another. Now, this philosophy of science, as I said, is sort of value-free, and assumes a value-free objectivity. Community psychologists completely disregard this philosophy of science. You will not find a community psychologist that adopts this philosophy of science. Other more traditional psychologists experimental psychologists might utilize this philosophy, but this is sort of going to the wayside in psychology currently. Now, more recent philosophies of science include postpositivism. Now, postpositivism is very closely related to positivism. The major difference in postpositivism is that researchers who adopt this philosophy of science, and you will find community psychologists who do adopt this philosophy of science. And I know in your chapter there was a discussion of a researcher named Chris Sullivan, and I've worked with Chris, and actually we've never had this discussion, but the research that she does using the experimental social innovation and dissemination model, the ESID model, would fit really well in this philosophy of science. And this philosophy of science, post-positivism, the real difference between this and positivism is that scientists adopting this philosophy will understand that knowledge is context-specific and knowledge is not value-free, meaning that from the outset of you conducting your research, you are necessarily biased in some way. So let me give you an example here. If I'm a post-positivist and I want to do research with homeless populations, for example, I necessarily chose to do research with homeless populations for one reason or another. I didn't randomly fall into it, right? So this is a philosophy of science that says the researcher has some bias, and what we need to do is try to control that bias out as much as we can, but there is a bias there, and there is an inherent bias there at some level, regardless of what that level is. Now, critical theory, the philosophy of science of critical theory, goes a little more further out, and critical theory is quite a bit further away from positivism in terms of where knowledge comes from.
And what critical theory says is that knowledge is shaped by power relations, and that can be power relations between the researcher and the researched. So if you're working particularly with marginalized populations, right? So for example, if you're working with populations with women who have been victims of domestic violence, for example, that population is necessarily less powerful in some respect because of that situation she is in, right? So that power relation is what really shapes the research and shapes the philosophy of science. And so community psychologists adopting this philosophy of science really take an activist stance to deconstruct these power relations and try to understand how power is manifested within society, and works to try to overturn some of that power and give power back to marginalized communities. Now, Constructivist is even further away from positivism compared to post-positivist and critical theory. And Constructivists are interesting. So I don't go this far out. Some researchers do, and some of my good friends would consider themselves constructivists. And what a constructivist would say is that there is no generalizable knowledge about anything, right? So knowledge is necessarily subjective, and it's a subjective reality of the person who lives that life. And so we cannot use something like quantitative methods, because quantitative methods are used to generalize across populations, right? So you get general trends in the data, and you assume that those general trends can generalize across different populations or mean the same thing between two different populations. Constructivists, on the other hand, do not use quantitative methods at all. They use qualitative methods. And the purpose of them using qualitative methods is to really understand the lived experiences of the individuals in which they work. So it's understanding the lived context. It's trying to understand the contextual meaning of the situation that is being studied. So if we look at it in terms of what reality is, or truth, right? If we're trying to get at truth, where we have objective on one end, subjective on the other, positivism would be on the far end of objective. So reality is objective, and we can figure that out with our science. Post-positivism is a little closer in, but it's still right there. Critical theory is closer to the subjective end, and constructivist is all the way over to that end. And if we look at quantitative and qualitative methods, it's really almost identical, right? So positivism, post-positivism primarily uses quantitative methods. Constructivist will use qualitative. The difference here is critical theory uses both. So they use sort of a mixed methods approach to understanding what's going on in their communities. So moving on for question number 2, how can we promote community participation and collaboration in research decisions? And so here I'm going to be talking about various types of community research and participatory community research. So there's a ton of different names for these. So these are these acronyms up here at the top. CBPR is community-based participatory research. PAR is participatory action research. AR is action research, etc., etc. There's a bunch of these, and the primary understanding of these is that they have a participatory approach to conducting research. And what that means is that they take an approach, researchers who utilize something like CBPR, or community-based participatory research, partners with their community organizations or the people in which they are studying to actually conduct research. Now, there's varied levels at which this can occur. So, you can, if you're taking a participatory research approach, you can sort of figure out with yourself and with your community to what extent that community should be involved in conducting the research. So it can be involved at simply establishing a partnership. It can go deeper, and it can go partnering with the community to actually conduct research decisions, right? So who's involved in the research, what methods are utilized in the research, who collects the data. So these are all decisions that are made in a collaborative manner with the community. And then the research products and impact, right? So what do we do when we're done with the data? Who does it go with? Who does it belong to? Who has ownership to that data? And this can be an interesting point, because if I'm getting research funds from, say, the National Science Foundation, and the National Science Foundation requires that they own the data, but I then go into a community and I work with a community that says that the community owns the data, what do we do, right? So these are the decisions that have to be made throughout the entire process of research, particularly when you're working with marginalized communities. And so I'll give you a quick example. I was working with a community, a national community organizing network a couple of years ago. And so I established a relationship, right, with this organization. And I actually wanted them to go throughout this whole process with me. I wanted them to assist me in, or not assist me, but collaborate with me in making research decisions. I wanted them to collaborate with me in the research products and impact, but they didn't want to. They were too big. So they essentially said, well, we'll partner with you, and we have your back, but after that, it's up to you. So you do your thing, and let us know what you found. So they basically were on. They were on board with this first part, establishing a relationship, but after that, it was all me. So it varies. It varies a lot depending on the community. And participatory research is important for community psychologists, particularly because of something like the Tuskegee Experiment. And so the Tuskegee Experiment, what researchers did, public health researchers, what they did is they went down to Tuskegee, Alabama, and they were conducting research on syphilis. And what they did is they had a cure for syphilis that they were basically experimenting with. So they would give some people with syphilis a placebo, and then they would give other people with syphilis the actual cure for the syphilis. And this was going on for 40 years. Even if after they found out that their cure was actually working, they continued to do an experimental method, and they left people with syphilis who they could have easily cured. And that created a huge amount of distrust among the community with regard to researchers. And so it can actually make it really difficult for researchers to partner with organizations, to partner with communities, because they have a distrust, right? So I'm sure you can imagine, say we're in the south side of Chicago, which is historically segregated. It's highly black African American, Black, and very, very poor. So I can imagine me as a white male researcher walking up to doors in the south side of Chicago, knocking on doors saying, "Hey, I want to do a study with you about crime in your area. Are you interested?" Can you imagine what that would look like? That would look very odd. And so it's important to know the right way to partner with organizations and partner with communities, so that legacy of distrust is not perpetuated. And finally, our last question here when we're conducting community research: at what ecological levels of analysis will we conduct our research? And so research can be conducted at each level. So I'll give you an example here. This is a mural that was conducted by Regina Langhout and her students in partnership with an after-school program in California. And what the students of the program did, and so she partnered with youth from the program, and youth actually conducted research on every level of analysis. They helped with the research, they helped collect the data for the research, they helped interpret the findings of the research, and they actually own the data. And so this is one of their products. They created a mural as part of their project to highlight their culture of their school and their after-school program. And their after-school program here is called Change for Good. And so in this project, in this Youth Participatory Action Research project, this occurred across multiple levels of analysis, right? So individual students were interviewed to understand their social position of power within the school and within the institution. And so that occurred at the individual level. At the microsystem level, Gina collected data among students and their friends, among youth and their friends, to understand their microsystem and how their friends' networks worked. She also sought to understand the effectiveness of the program itself. So she was looking at organizational level outcomes and looking at how those organizational level variables influenced the individual level variables. Additionally, localities, she sought to understand the cultural context of the city by conducting this study, and also the effectiveness of California after-school programs in general. So she was really looking across all levels of analysis. But when we're conducting community research, it's necessary to understand and know and define which level of analysis we're going to be working within. So to summarize everything, for community psychology, research is not value-free. So I would argue if you take a stance that your research is value-free, you're probably not a community psychologist. Community collaborations are extremely important for community psychologists. They make our research better. The community makes our research more valid. So we call it face validity, which means it has, on the face of it, value and validity within that particular context. And it's important to understand the impact across multiple ecological levels, to understand how your research is influencing various ecological levels of analysis, and from what level they're coming from what level your questions are coming from.